Thanks so much, Jim. I'm actually really delighted to be here today to talk about Queens and how Queens has changed over, well, it's really over, I think, about a 50-year period, because I think it's important for people to understand it kind of as it's going, because there's been massive, massive changes in both New York and in Queens. And the presentation I have is actually, you may get whiplash, except you won't because you're going to be sitting there, but a lot of it has to do with showing you pictures of where various groups live and things like that. And basically, Queens is amazingly diverse. I mean, there's no two ways about it. And it's been amazingly diverse ever since it really got settled. And Queens really got settled back in the 30s and 40s. Before the 30s and 40s, Queens was not very highly populated, but once the advent of the subway lines, Queens kind of filled up. And so New York City itself was more or less, was basically the way it looks or the way people have settled. A lot of it was driven by the subway. So this first chart, which compares Queens with the rest of New York City, and the red bar is foreign-born and the blue bar is native-born. And you can see over time, 1910, a lot of native-born, more foreign-born outside. And then as you go across the decades, in 40, and they don't have data for 50 and 60, 70, and it starts growing massively after 40, the number of people who were born abroad. And so I think that's really one of the stories of Queens, that it's been the home and the host of many people who've come from overseas. And this has been true really for quite a long time, but it's become increasingly true recently. And then this is just the percentages. It's the same chart, but looking at the percent. And you can see from that right now Queens is really heavily foreign-born if you go out to the final bar there. So then the question is, over time, how about where are the foreign-born? And this is foreign-born in 1940, and that's foreign-born in 1950, 60, 70. Well, actually, I think that's 70 doesn't exist. So that's 2000, and the closest we have to the 2010 census that has foreign-born. So you can see that both in New York City and in Queens, there's been an incredible increase in foreign-born population. And lots of people don't realize how much New York has changed. I didn't really put together slides on this, but in terms of racial composition, in terms of foreign-born, in terms of Hispanics, Hispanic heritage, right around 50, New York was actually less diverse or had fewer African Americans proportionally than the suburbs do now. So there's been a massive shift in population. And we just did a quick estimate for the Times the other day, because Sam Roberts wanted to compare the Giuliani election with the upcoming election. And we did an estimate, and it's over 60% of the people who lived in New York in 1993, or we'll put it another way, only 40% of the people who lived in New York in 1993 still live here. So the turnover is just like incredible, and you have to realize this. I mean, it's true in many other cities, but I think New York is particularly that way because it's where people come from abroad. And the other thing, now this is, I should probably give this to John. Do you have a website for this thing? Or, yeah, we put this up on the website, but this shows you the massive diversity of the various groups here. And what this does, it ranks them by whether they're in Queens, rank in Queens, and then if they're in the top 20 within the rest of New York. And you can see China and Ecuador very high up, Guyana, India, but you'll also find in there some of the kind of traditional, what we consider the traditional groups, immigrant groups, like Irish and Italian particularly, who have been coming in recently. And this shows you the count. So China is over here. This is just Queens. So China, there's about 100,000 born in China, tremendous number in Ecuador, Guyana and British Guyana, Colombia, going on across down to the Barbados, where we only have a small fraction. Obviously, the West Indian population is more concentrated in and around Flatbush, and much less so in Queens. So if you go out to the area by Laurelton, Jamaica, there are quite a number of West Indian, from various West Indian groups out there. Trinidad and Tobago is large, for example. So this is a question of where did the various immigrant groups settled. And this is this is the number one group, and the China, born in China, excluding Hong Kong and Taiwan. And you can see that there are a lot of them in Flushing, and then as you go over to Bayside and on out to Bayside, there's a tremendous number of Chinese. And I remember when Hong Kong was absorbed by mainland China, I got a call from a real estate reporter, and she reported to me, sometimes the reporters report to you, she reported to me that people had been moving into Bayside, Chinese people straight from China had been moving into Bayside and buying houses for like cash, $400,000, $500,000. And the obvious thing they were doing is they wanted to have a safe house in case things really didn't go well in Hong Kong, in the mainland China. So that's the Chinese, Ecuador, different area, much more over toward Jackson Heights, and in that area. Now the thing about the Northwest Queens, which includes Jackson Heights and other areas around there, the thing about that area is it's massively diverse. I mean, there are people from Hong Kong, there are people from China, there are people from Pakistan, there are people from India, and they're all living in relative proximity. They don't live necessarily next to one another. In fact, I always have a running joke about Queens that Queens has it's very diverse. It has many different ethnic and immigrant groups, and each group is ethnocentric in their own way. And, if you think about Queens, who's iconically Queens? If you think about, now a long time ago, I found that a lot of my students had never heard of him, but who would be iconically a Queens product that made it onto television? The obvious answer, of course, is Archie Bunker. And you got to remember Archie. Archie was very, ethnocentric, somewhat prejudiced of other groups, particularly African Americans. And I think that you do find this within Queens. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different groups, and the real trick, and I'm not saying that we've completely succeeded in finding this trick, is to try to have all these different groups live together. So Ecuador, heavily Northwest Queens. Guyana, very heavily in Richmond Hill. And, I remember I've had a number of Guyanese students. I have one actually this term in my class. But I remember very well that I had two students from Richmond Hill. One was an older guy who was trying to have a stand-up career. And he lived at his parents' house, which had been built 100 years before, and they'd owned it all the time. And he actually interviewed the guy next door who was over 100 years old and had been born, and was born when he was born. His family lived in that house. And so he interviewed a variety of people to see what they thought of the changes in Richmond Hill. And by the way, Richmond Hill has had a very big, increase of Guyanans, as this shows. And they were horrified about the changes. And then I had also in the very same class, I had a Guyanese student, and she went out and did interviews, and she, of course, interviewed people that she knew, and they thought Richmond Hill was the most wonderful neighborhood they'd ever seen. So you get this, I think it shows you the kind of the dual perspective as a group comes in and as a group goes out, or as a group is declining, and the Guyanese are a very large group. Now this is Colombia. They're also concentrated in, outside of Queens, but they're also concentrated in Northwest Queens. India, also to some extent Northwest Queens. Dominican Republic, we have some in Northwest Queens, but the big concentration of Dominican Republic is obviously up in Washington Heights and north into the Bronx. Korea, also in Bayside. So you have very, very rapid change of Bayside to becoming much more of a Asian community. One of the reasons I believe is that the school district there, it's a public school district, is really excellent. And I don't know if anybody has been up to Bayside, looking on Bell Boulevard early, like late in August. I remember I had a student work for me who was from Singapore, and we used to occasionally go up there and eat lunch, and we were up there to eat lunch, and there were all these banners going across Bell Boulevard advertising courses to cram for SAT exams. And some of them were bilingual. They were partially in Chinese and partially in English. And the running joke between me and Kara Sang, who now actually works at the New School in Institutional Research, was that I always joked with her, I said, is part of Chinese culture taking an SAT course? But they obviously, the Asian community's done quite well. They pick Bayside because of the schools, I'm sure. Then you have Mexicans. The Mexicans are also a very interesting group because they're kind of like in certain ways, I'll show this in a minute, they're very hardworking, very recent immigrants. In 1990, the census only counted 30,000 Mexicans. In New York now, it's approaching 300,000. Massive growth of Mexicans. Up until the 90s, the Mexicans hadn't really discovered New York. And that's really one of the stories of immigration here. We have so many different groups. If you're in many, many cities and you say immigrants, it's really decoded as Mexican. It's not, not other groups. But here it's all these various groups. And Jamaica, we have a lot of Jamaicans in Southeast Queens, very affluent area around Laurelton. This is Filipinos. Filipinos are over more in Rosedale. A lot of them are in the healthcare field. Bangladesh, also some over in sort of in eastern Queens, but some of them also in the area around Astoria, Jackson Heights, etc. And then this is Haitians. A lot of them also are intersettled in Southeast Queens. Trinidad and Tobago, also a number of them in Southeast Queens. Poland, there people have come from Poland, from the former Soviet Union, from Italy, Peru. I had a Peruvian student whose parents ran a restaurant. It was called American Restaurant, and it was in Jackson Heights. This is Greece. So every time we ever do anything on Astoria, we always get a call from a Greek person who says, your count on the number of Greeks in Astoria is wrong. The truth of the matter is many, many Greeks have moved out to Long Island, and they probably go back there for the wonderful restaurants that are in Astoria. And then Taiwan, they're sort of I would call them an echo of the other Chinese. And then El Salvador, there's a chunk of them. I don't really know much about that. Pakistan, Russia, of course, out in the Brighton Beach area, but also in and around Forest Hills. China, Hong Kong, they're also, if there's any concentrations, also similar to the other Chinese groups. Honduras, Ukraine, Israel, we do have some Israelis that have moved in, and Barbados, which once again are more likely in the Flatbush neighborhood. So then what we're going to look at really quickly, and we'll see how I'm doing for time here, pretty well, are the percent of male percentage of the various groups. And as you go across this, you can see like the Mexicans are off the charts. Most really large chunk of Mexicans are for male. If you look at Jamaica, it's much lower. And one of the reporters from the New York Times, when the 2000 census came out, she worked on the Jamaicans in New York, and it turns out that the Jamaican ascent has really been driven by the women. And there are a lot of women who come, they get into the healthcare field, not very high up, not like nurses, but, practical nurses, that sort of thing. But they're very hardworking, they work a lot, and they often buy the house. And the other thing she found out was some of the Jamaicans told her that the men didn't like the U.S. because it wasn't patriarchal enough, and so they went back to Jamaica. And then this is educational attainment. You see how diverse this is. I mean, you know, you have Korea, very high, in this case, high school is blue, college is red, and you can see that it really varies by group. Like Mexicans are among the lowest, Koreans are among the highest, and it goes right across. Then this is the employment status. Once again, a very highly diverse group in terms of employment status. The Mexicans are very largely employed. And then the percent married also among the groups, and that also varies massively. So what I'm saying here is that it's not just that we have lots of immigrants in Queens, but the immigrants we have in Queens are very, very diverse among the groups. And it's a very interesting thing. I think it's probably unique in the United States to have such diversity of immigrants all living next to one another. We recently did a collected book on New York and LA, and I mean, in New York and LA, they're virtually all Mexicans, but there are places like Chicago where there's like 600,000 Mexicans. You know, who would think it? So it's a very diverse immigrant stream here. And then this is the average wages of working members of the various groups. And you can see, like, India towers above, Mexico towers below. I should have one other chart, which I don't have here. If you look at household income, the Mexican household income is actually not nowhere near that low because they have so many people in the households who are working. And so whereas the Indians are in professional fields, then some of them are in the areas kind of made famous by David Letterman, if you ever watched David Letterman, Surajul Mujibbar and Surajul, you know, they work in, you know, kind of convenience stores, 7-Eleven, and then increasingly in hotels. And in fact, there's a couple of hotel chains in the United States that were developed by Mexican families where the first generation, you know, had like the Ramada Express, and then the second generation had like major resorts. So it's a very, very diverse group, and that's my presentation. I may have finished early.